Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to Stepping Up Kosher for this week. We are in the middle of our longest section yet, which is milk and meat. And last week we left off in the middle of talking about when milk and meat touch each other. So we had started off nice and light. You have maybe two things that are cold that touch each other. No problem, give it a rinse off. Maybe in some instances you need to shave a little bit off. You can see last week to see all the details of when and what. You're good to go. We got a little bit more complicated. What did we say? Pickling. Don't forget that pickling from a halachic perspective is that if your milk or your meat sits in water for longer than 24 hours, that's considered pickling. Or if it's something sharp, it's longer than 18 minutes, and then it's considered pickling. And if that's the case, it is now almost like actively cooking. So now if milk or meat goes in it, it's a different situation, right? Okay, we discussed being careful about cooking, even if milk and meat touch. And it's perfectly fine. We're going to say you're allowed to eat it because it's such a tiny drop and it's cold, etc. Right? No problem. But you're not allowed to go and actively cook that item now, even if you know there's a tiny drop of milk in it, because that would actively be cooking milk and meat, which is also a prohibition. So this is just a brief summary of what we discussed last week. Today we're going to take it up a notch. Today we're going to talk about what about when milk and meat touch each other and one of them is cooking. What about that? Right? So the first instance that he has for us is basar shenafal lechalav cham. Meat that falls into hot milk. So let's set up the case. You have a pot of milk or a pot of milchig soup, like a milk soup, a creamy soup of some sort, right? And it's sitting on the fire and it's bubbling. Or maybe it's not even bubbling, it's hot, right? And you have a piece of meat. Good morning, Michelle. Welcome. We literally just started, so you're good to go. Good morning, Greg. Have some breakfast. Come join us. So you have this pot and it's hot and it's sitting on the fire and you want to I'm sorry, not you want to. You see a piece of meat. Somebody's walking by. They have maybe a plate with a whole bunch of burgers on it or something, and one of them slides off, falls right into the pot of milk. Anybody? What's your knee-jerk reaction? What should you do right away? Well, that's not going to help anybody. Yes, that might be your reaction, but what's the first thing we should do? Throw it all out. No, hold on. First thing you should do is take out the piece of meat that fell into the pot of milk. Okay? With what? What are you using? What are you sticking in? Your fingers? It's hot.
No,
tongues? A meat tongues or a milk tongues?
A
part of tongues? It's even worse?
No, that's worse. Whatever you use, it's going to be you're going to.
The best is to use something disposable.
Yeah.
That's what he says right away. Okay. The best thing is to use something disposable and not with any sort of fork or knife that you're going to need to use afterwards. Why? Because then you're going to need to kosherize that fork or that tongs or whatever it is you're going to use to take it out. Okay. Immediately afterwards, the first thing you do is check the temperature of the milk. Okay, if it is lower than 43 degrees Celsius, hold on, they have the conversion here? No, they don't. Can anybody convert it for us?
Like 40, 90 or something?
43 degrees Celsius to Fahrenheit?
43 degrees Celsius.
109. All right? Okay, so if it's lower than 109, 110 degrees Fahrenheit, then you should just rinse it off and dry it off in the place where the meat touched the milk, and then you are allowed to eat the meat. Okay? Same thing with the milk.
How do you take the temperature, though? Because you'd have to throw out your thermometer or rekosher your thermometer.
Good question. I think the assumption is like that you would know. I mean, in most instances, let's put it this way. If it's 100 or 105, still stick away from it. And if it's 120, 130, you're also not going to. What he's saying is it's not too hot. It's a warm dish. Whatever. Right, exactly. It's way less than boiling. Yeah. Boiling is 212. Okay. Now, the same thing with the milk. Milk is allowed to be drunk. Okay. Can anybody give me a reason for this? Why?
Milk.
Why can you drink the milk and you can eat the meat as long as you rinse it off and take it and dry it off? Why are you allowed to eat the meat or milk? Isn't it? No, it's warm. Remember we said warm or even slightly hot.
But it's not.
The answer is because of the 1 in 60 rule. Remember that? The 1 in 60 rule tells you that the piece of meat is not left inside the milk dish. That would be a big issue because then you probably don't have 60 for it, right? But if you took the meat out, now all you're talking about is a little bit of gravy that might have fallen off from it. There's definitely 60 to it, right? Okay. What if it's hotter than 110 degrees? So then he says, in this case, forget it. Both of them are now asur. They're prohibited. Why? Yeah. But I want to remind you of something. The meat was cold. Remember that? The burger was leftovers from a barbecue. It fell into the milk, right? Let's see. it's just my chair. Okay. No, it's just my chair, I think. Okay. The milk was hot, but the meat was not, right? So why are we saying that the meat is not allowed if it wasn't hot? The answer is because when hot and cold touch each other, there is a rule that you may remember from when Rabbi Marazav was here and he spoke at the 19th of Kislev Shabbat dinner that we had here, which is called Tata Gavar. Tata Gavar means when you have something hot and something not hot that are going to touch each other, we always go based on the bottom one. The bottom one wins, so to speak. What does that mean? Because the milk was sitting on the fire, so this was milk that, okay, it wasn't boiling, it wasn't bubbling, but it was very hot and sitting on the fire, right? So the meat that fell into it is considered as if it was also hot. Why? Because as soon as it falls into it, it's considered just like the bottom one. The bottom one wins, so to speak. Okay? So in this case, where it's we're saying now that the milk is, let's say, bubbling, very, very hot, right? And now the piece of meat goes inside of it, even though the piece of meat is going to cool it off to some degree or another, right? That's just what happens. If you've ever taken something cold and thrown it into a pot or a pan that has hot oil or water in it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It starts to sizzle right away. What is that? That is the cool meat starting to warm up and the hot oil starting to cool down, right? So there's a process here that's happening, but still we consider it as if they're both hot because the bottom wins. And that's why in this instance they're both prohibited.
Question.
Yes.
So if you're taking a piece of
Hold on. Let me just finish with this last point. Unless the pot of milk is so large that it is 60 times the entire piece of meat, right? So when it was warm, we said you could take the piece of meat out, and then you have 60 against whatever little drops came off. But when it's batal b'shishim, exactly 1 in 60. But when it's so hot that as soon as the meat goes in, it's cooking in there, it's boiling hot, then the rule of 1 in 60 doesn't apply. Or whatever, it applies, but it applies to the entire piece of meat. And the chances of you having more than 60 times in the pot for the piece of meat are possible, but very slim, and that's why he's saying you would need to both of them would be prohibited. Now, what if you do have 1 in 60? Let's say you're making a massive pot of milk and a tiny little piece of meat fell in, right? So he says, in that case, it's allowed, but not the piece of meat. You're still not allowed to eat the piece of meat, which was hot, with milk that was hot. You don't have 1 in 60 against the meat, against the milk, right? It's going to be fully absorbed, the taste. So he says, the piece of meat you take out, you throw it in the trash, and now the pot of milk, I'm trying to think, I think, and the pot of milk will be allowed. In this case, I want to say, also introduces another rule, which is, even though we say 1 in 60, that's never for davar shebe'ein. These things never apply for something you can actually see, right? When we say 1 in 60, it doesn't mean that now you can, so let's say we say 1 in 60, so you can eat the milk. And as you're eating this milk soup, you come across the piece of meat, you see it with your eyes.
Right.
You're not allowed to actually eat that, because that's visual. Okay, so that's one of the things when it comes to bittul, when it comes to nullification, 1 in 60 or 51%, sometimes the rule is, whatever it is, right? In all these instances, it does not apply to davar shebe'ein, to something that you can actually visually see with your eye. Okay. That's the end of that halacha. Yes,
I was
Yehuda.
gonna say, what if like you're taking out the piece of meat and it breaks, and then you gotta take another
Same
piece
thing.
of the piece, but then there might be like pieces of it that broke off that are small, you
Absolutely.
can't even
So
get.
you would have to follow the rule 1 in 60.
And if not, they're both.
Unless, so if you know, in other words, let's say it was a burger, so
Yeah.
it was this big, and then you pull it out, and you got half of it, and the other half is still in there. So you have to try to get the other half, right? But if it starts at, so yeah, you got to be able to try and estimate whether it's going to be 1 in 60 or not. Yes.
So going along kind of that same theory, but not an actual piece of meat. So you're busy in your kitchen, you don't pay attention, you grab a spoon and you put it into
And
the
now it needs
milk
to be
and you
kosherized.
realize,
And now it needs to be kosherized.
right, but does it rest does the 60th rule apply because you put a meat spoon into the...
Are we still talking about the same situation where there was a piece of meat? Avram, it's okay, I got it. Are we still talking about the same piece of meat that fell into a pot of milk?
No, let's just say we have that pot of milk.
And you just took a meat spoon.
And you grab a spoon and you're not paying
It's
attention.
a clean meat.
Right.
And it happens to be a milk clean spoon. Yes?
No, it was a meat clean spoon, and also
Oh,
the same
that
question,
went into a
if
milk
it was
dish.
a meat dirty spoon, same kind of
Right.
theory. What do? You can't
So-
like pick it out.
That's
right?
very common.
Yeah.
Right.
That,
I mean, we grab
that is very common in most. So you're really jumping a little bit ahead, but that's okay. We can address it now. In that instances, a few rules apply. First of all, you should call a rabbi. That's the first thing you should do. The rabbi will most likely follow the following rules with you. Number one, he's going to ask you how old the spoon. So if it's clean, Let's assume this. If the spoon is dirty, he's going to ask you if it's 1 in 60. If it's 1 in 60, it's fine, right? But the spoon definitely needs to be kosherized, as does the pot.
Right.
But the dish might be fine. The spoon, he's going to start to ask you questions. If it was clean, when was it last used? Are we sure that it's over 24 hours since it was last used? If so, then you're fine. Why? Because then we talk. You might remember this rule. We've discussed this in the past. 24 hours makes it tam pogum, which means the taste is now considered disgusting taste from a halachic perspective. Why? Because it's old, it's gross, it's not enhancing flavor, right? It's a detrimental flavor, call it. Right? Follow?
Okay.
Let's assume that it was not that it was much more recent, or that it was even still dirty on it. So then the spoon definitely needs to be kosherized.
But you can still have the milk.
Depending on the 1 in 60, and depending on all that sort of stuff. And I'm looking for a passive where that's really good. Yeah. Here you go, me the little Chloe town. You happy to have that? Okay. Okay. Let's do the opposite. What about a drop of milk that fell into a plate with meat, right? Where the meat was hot. So in such a situation, you're not allowed to eat the meat. Why? Because the meat is now the bottom, right? And the meat is hot. So as soon as the milk goes into it, it's cooking, and then no good. You have the prohibition of milk and meat. Unless you check, and now there's 60 in the meat against the milk. So for example, let's say it was just a drop of milk and went onto a full piece of meat, right? So then the taste gets nullified, as we know with the rule of 1 in 60, and any milk that's obvious on the face of the meat you have to throw out, obviously, because you can't do, again, the nullification does not work for something that's visual, right? And then you can eat a piece of meat and throw out whatever that little bit of milk that you see, sponge it up, throw out the napkin, and now you can eat the meat, because it's 1 in 60.
If it's 160.
Yeah. Little reminder now, you cannot do any of this actively. We're talking about a hot piece of meat. In this case, we were talking about a hot piece of meat. Last week we discussed when it's cold, it's very different. But when you're talking about a hot piece of meat, that's what we're talking about. Just a general reminder that this cannot be done actively, consciously to begin with. You can't do that. You have to. All these rules are talking about after the fact. Not that you choose to go and do this because I want flavor inside the meat. You know what I'll do? I'll put in one tiny drop of milk and it gives enough for the whole meat, and I'm good to go. Right? No, it doesn't work that way because it's 1 in 60. No, it doesn't.
It's only for accidental.
This is all after the fact. Yeah. Okay. What about a piece of hot meat that fell into cold milk? Last time we spoke about a piece of cold meat that fell into hot milk. I don't know if everybody's following here. And now we want to talk about a piece of hot meat that falls into cold milk. Right? So now, what's the big difference in the case? You don't have the rule of Tata Gavar, or whatever. You have the rule of Tata Gavar, which means that the bottom always wins, but the temperature of the bottom one is cold. So does it cool off the hot piece of meat that fell into it? Let's see. So he says, obviously the first thing you should do is take out the piece of meat using a disposable piece of fork or knife or whatever, or spoon. And you should not use anything real, or that you shouldn't need to kosherize it. And after that, you should shave off a piece of the meat, a minimal amount. Like the least that you can, it's called kidei klipa. The minimal amount that you can shave off. It doesn't make a difference. It's not like you can even do an inch or half inch. A tiny drop, the face of the meat. Shave that off. And then the rest of the meat you're allowed to eat. Why? Let's follow this through. We said that there is a rule called Tata Gavar. Tata Gavar means that the lower, the bottom dish, the temperature of that is what wins. What was the milk, which was the bottom dish, which is what it fell into, was cold. So it immediately cools off. We're considering it immediately cooling off the meat. And if so, then you don't have a prohibition of milk and meat cooking together. What do you have? A prohibition of milk and meat touching each other. So that we already discussed last time. No big deal, right? Just shave it off and you're good to go, right? Same thing with the milk. The milk would also be allowed. And the same thing the opposite, if there was some sort of meat gravy that was cold, and then a hot piece of, I don't know, something dairy. What's something dairy that's hot? A hot piece of, yeah, but I don't know that cheese is hot. When cheese is hot, it melts. Whatever, something cheesy. Cheese, whatever, something hot falls in. Again, the bottom one is the one that wins. We consider cooling it off. You just have to shave off the edges, and then it's kosher and you're good to go. Okay. What about if you don't have meat? You have a meat dish. Okay, so far we've been talking about a hot piece of meat, cold milk, hot milk, cold meat, whatever it is, right? What if the thing that you're going into is not even meat? It's meaty. It's fleshig, right? So let's say, for example, chicken soup. Maybe the chicken's not even in there anymore. Now, we all know that eating chicken soup makes us wait 6 hours. Why? Because it falls into the category of fleshig, right? But once you have chicken soup, and the way you make your chicken soup is you put the chicken, some people do that, they put the chicken or the chicken bones into a net, they put it in. The net, ironically, is called a cheesecloth. They put it inside the chicken soup, and then it seeps and seeps and seeps, and they take the chicken out because they don't like that piece of chicken in the chicken soup. So now you have a meaty, or a fleshig, let's call it, soup, but it's not actually flake. It's not actual meat. And a piece of milk falls into that, right? Okay. So what he wants to tell you now, and this is a rule that you can keep in mind, is that the moment that you have a dish which had meat cooked inside of it, and there was meat going everywhere, maybe this is what you meant kind of with the pieces of meat, the entire dish becomes now like meat. So let's take that chicken soup. The chicken could not even be here anymore. You had a big pot of water. You put in some vegetables, the whole thing is paraf. Then you took a chicken and you let it seep in there for an hour, for 2 hours, whatever, it doesn't make a difference. The entire pot is now considered like chicken. Or like meat, right? And therefore, if a piece of milk goes in, when you're calculating, for example, 1 to 60, or a piece of cheese goes in, or a piece of whatever, you have to calculate now with the whole soup as part of your calculation, right? So, and it's not like you could say, oh, the 1 in 60 rule applies to the chicken that used to be in there to the cheese. It doesn't work that way. It's the actual dish. Look, it fell down on the floor. You see it? Here it is. You want it? You want some
What
snacks?
about when the pacifier falls on the ground?
If the pacifier falls on the ground, then it depends. If there's 1 in 60 in the dirt on the floor. Good answer. You like it? Okay. Oh, there goes the pacifier again. Because we found snacks. Snacks are much better than pacifiers. Okay, there you go. All right, let's keep going. Hopefully this will entertain her enough that we'll be able to keep going. Really, you're supposed to be napping now, sweetie. We love you. Okay. All right. Let's up the ante, yes? We started off with cold. We moved on to pickling. We then moved on to hot, right? But till now, we've been talking about 110 degrees. Over 110 degrees, under 110 degrees, whatever it is. What if the pot is literally on the fire? It's not just on the stovetop, cooling down. It's not just on the table, just came off the stove, so it's still hot or warm. It's literally bubbling, right? So you have, for example, a drop of milk that gets poured or that falls onto a piece of meat, which is boiling hot in the middle of sizzling in the pan, right? And the piece of meat is sticking out of the gravy, whatever it is that's in the pan that it's sizzling in, right? So it's literally onto the piece of meat. Immediately take out the piece of meat and check if the piece of meat itself, not the gravy, the piece of meat itself, is 60 times more than the drop of milk, you're allowed to eat it, and if it's less, then you're not allowed to eat it. It's prohibited. Okay? All right. What if you take the piece of meat or whatever it is, you have some sort of stir fry going on inside the pan, and you were shaking it. You were in the middle of shaking it like this, you're middle of, you're cooking, right? Or maybe you're in the middle of stirring it. And now the drop of milk fell in, right? And you just kept stirring. You just kept, or maybe you immediately put the cover back on. Maybe you were in the middle of doing it and somebody else was the one who dropped the drop of milk and not thinking, right? This could often happen if you have non-Jewish help in the kitchen sometimes, right? They don't know. And as much as a crash course that you try to give to your housekeeper, inevitably they think you're nuts.
They look at you with
They're
a blank
like,
stare, right?
Whatever, I'll try, but I have no idea what you're talking about.
I've seen that.
I never even bother telling my housekeepers the terms meat, milk, and parv. I just say green, red, and blue, because that's how it works in our house. And she knows the red is not allowed to mix with the blue, and the blue. Anyways, so you're in the middle of mixing, you're in the middle of whatever, you're about to put the cover on. And basically, the point here is that you cannot measure.
Yum.
Something flew in, you watch, some milk went in, but it's not like you could pause, stop, let's check how much milk, let's take out the piece of meat and see how much. You can see. So in this case, because you cannot check, he says the entire dish becomes asur. The entire dish becomes prohibited, and you're not allowed to eat it. But let's say it was after a moment, right? It wasn't. Let's say you saw it. You saw the milk get poured in there, you saw it sit there, and you were about to take care of it, and then you absentmindedly just took the spoon and started mixing. Right? So it was after a moment. But basically what happens is now there's a suffix, there's a doubt in your mind. You're not sure whether there's enough, especially because some of the milk has had a chance. Remember, we said you're supposed to take it out immediately and rinse it off and dry it off. But in this case, there's been enough time for the milk to get seeped into the piece of meat, right? So you're coming back. So if you're sure, again, we said sometimes there's a doubt, and then you have to just go to the stringent and throw the whole thing out. But if you're sure that there is 60 times in the piece of meat for the drop of milk, then it doesn't matter. Even if it got seeped in and you didn't have a chance to properly shake it off or rinse it off, it's fine. You're good to eat it. But that would need to be. Now, what? I don't know. There's a lot of details. Listen, that's why it's not supposed to happen, and that's why also we always say. I want to say something, especially as we're getting into the real, the woods with these laws. One of the main reasons to think about these laws, what's the common joke the rabbis like to make after you finish a class like this, is you say, okay, and right now there's going to be a test, and we're going to test you on all of it. And if you don't remember all of it, that's it. You can't, right? It doesn't work that way. Like for example, if somebody's converting to Judaism, right? This is not the type of thing the type of thing that they're going to test them on and say, hey, a very specific type of case, is it allowed or is it not allowed? What they want to know is, you should learn all those laws. Why? Because when you learn all those laws, then when something happens in the kitchen, you can detect when is there going to be a problem. When is there, I'm aware of what could be problematic, what can't be problematic, and if I know when to call a rabbi and when not to call a rabbi. So I guess my point is, as we go through all of these different laws, right, if you're not remembering every single detail, and if you didn't write them all down in your notebooks, and you can't consult your notes, that's fine. At least you know when, in the back of your mind, because you've been exposed to all this kind of information, you know when you're going to need to go and ask a rabbi. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I hope that helps
We'll
to calm everybody down from the anxiety. I'm not going to remember all these
That's
details.
your motivation of this class.
That is my motivation in this class. Well, not for the whole class, but for these details. When it comes to checking lettuce, you should never need to call a rabbi. When we discuss bugs, you should be aware of how to do it on your own and be able to be self-empowered to do it. But when it comes to meat and milk, the basics you need to know, yes. You need to know good practices, and that's what we've been doing for other weeks. But this week, these kind of nitty-gritty, it's perfectly fine. If as soon as something happens, you take it out, and then you call the rabbi. Yes, Vicky?
See, where I'm struggling, it's like, I get it. You can't have a cheeseburger, right? You can't cook milk
And meat,
have a hamburger, even a separate hamburger with it, right?
Correct.
With a glass of milk, right? These things I understand, and I would expect if I'm going to keep kosher,
Right.
I shouldn't do this,
Right.
okay? But when I get to the weeds, when I get to the water bottles, when I get to the knife and the thing, when I get to this, I lead a busy life. I don't even think about these things. And I didn't grow up with it like you
Right,
did,
correct.
right? Where it becomes second
And I understand the
nature.
challenge,
I don't
yes.
think about that. How do I, and yet I don't want to feel guilty all the time that I'm trying to keep kosher and I'm not. And I do this with grabbing the fork
Right.
and grabbing,
Right, yeah.
I'm not thinking. I'm
Yeah.
older especially, I don't pay attention
Yes.
enough. And I don't think about it, and now I did it, and
I'm
do
so
I have
glad
to
you
throw
brought
out
this
the
up.
whole meal.
I'm so glad.
That was my fault.
Yeah.
That's what you were thinking also. Okay. I'm very glad you brought this up. I attempted to address this in naming this class. Remember that? The name of this class is Stepping Up Kosher.
Right.
If it makes you feel better, you should know that I make mistakes in the kitchen all the time. And that's okay. Mistakes are made. And we're constantly learning and we're constantly growing and we're constantly trying to get better at the laws of kosher. And I will remind you of a famous passage in the Talmud, where the Talmud says, Lo nitna Torah l'malachi asharet. The Torah was not given to ministering angels. If God wanted perfect human beings, in English vernacular, we say, the Torah was not given to robots. Nobody expects you to be perfect. What everybody expects is that you should be growing every single day in your service of Hashem. So, I've met people that all of a sudden they get exposed for the first time. What? There's bugs in strawberries? What? There's bugs in lettuce? I can't believe it. I never knew about this. And because they're in their 40s, and they never heard about this, therefore it must not be true. Right? So, and in other words, basically, they have a hard time changing their ways because that is kind of admitting that what I've been doing for the past, God knows how many years, has been wrong. And I've been making mistakes, etc. And I think for this, it's always important to remember that the Torah was not given to angels. The Torah was not given to robots. And it's perfectly fine and it's perfectly okay to be making mistakes, and even mistakes you've been making for many years of your life. That's perfectly fine. That's who you are, and that's the way you serve Hashem. And Hashem wants those kind of people to serve Hashem. If not, He would have created robots. He would have had a much better system. Right? Very soon, we're going to be able to say this statement, which is like this. We want robots to drive our cars. We want robots to wash our laundry, because that's what's going to happen soon. And we know that in 10, 15 years from now, none of us will be driving cars. We'll all be in these driving those cars, floating around the city, getting in and out. It'll be totally normal. It'll be like elevators. Right? Elevators used to be people that navigated the elevators, right? And nobody would get into one if it was automated, right?
And if it's automated, can you get in one on Shabbat?
We could talk about that at a different time. Maybe they'll come out with Shabbat Waymos,
They'll have to come
maybe
up
like
with
Shabbos
Shabbat
elevators,
rules.
right?
Yeah, no,
of course, they'll have to. That generation will have to apply the rules of Shabbos to those laws, absolutely. But here's the point that I'm making. In a few years from now, we'll be able to say that statement. We'll say, I want robots to broadcast me on Facebook. I want robots to do my taxes for me on my computer. I want robots to drive my cars. I want robots to cook my food. All of those sorts of things I'm okay with robots doing. I don't want robots to serve Hashem.
Yeah.
Why? Because that's the one thing that will be that is left for us. Hashem doesn't want robots to serve Him. We know that. We have that on good authority. The Talmud in Tractate Shabbat tells us a story about when Moses came up to receive the Torah, that the ministering angel said, Mali lud isha beinenu. What is this son of a woman? That's always how, when they want to make fun of us, they say like a man who was born, he was born to a physical human being. Like, you're kidding me? Look at them. Angels are not, right? Angels are. What is he doing here? What is he doing here? And Hashem said, he's here to receive the Torah. They said, what? That amazing Torah, you're going to give it down to the physical world, these physical beings are going to make so many mistakes. And whatever, a whole discussion ensued. And ultimately, Moshe won that argument. Why? Because Hashem wants human beings with a Yetzer Hara and with an evil inclination and who make mistakes, etc. He wants human beings to be serving Him. He doesn't want these ministering angels, these robots, these people who are going to be perfect to do it. What He wants is that a human being who makes mistakes, comes to a class and finds out that maybe it's not the best idea to use a water bottle in the middle of a meat meal, in the middle of a milk meal, say, you know what, I'm going to change, I'm going to be a little bit better from now on. That's it. That's what I would say. That's my answer. And I attempted to address all that. Granted, maybe that was a little ambitious, but I attempted to address all that in the name of the class, stepping up kosher. That it's supposed to be about stepping up. If you're growing, then it's a sign you're alive, and it's a sign you're a good Jew. If today you're better than yesterday.
Okay, one last question.
And if you're filthy, it's a sign that you have children.
So you messed up that fork we talked about.
Yes.
I have a sterilization cycle on my dishwasher. A lot of people do.
Oh,
Does that
interesting.
count?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know enough about the dishwashers to say. It's very
You
interesting.
sterilize it, that way.
Well, I'll tell you how you kosher something, and if that happens in the dishwasher, then that's fine. It has to be completely immersed inside water that is boiling hot.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know. I don't know.
Sterilization
But
cycle.
it's not completely immersed.
It is, because the water goes through it and completely immerses it in a cycle. If you go through a cycle, it will.
Then at some point
completely
it fills up with
immerse.
water,
Yeah.
like a washing machine. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I do not know the answer to the question. And
That's what
the
I
water has to be
kind of
boiling.
doing when I
The water has to be
mess up.
boiling.
I mess up a lot.
Maybe that's what it is. The water has to be boiling. Is it boiling in there? Like literally 212.
Sterilization cycle.
Yeah?
Yeah. It's
Okay.
hot.
I don't know.
Yeah. You have
I don't know. Maybe that's a good.
Yeah.
I never heard of that hack. Maybe that's like a self-cleaning oven.
I think it is. That's what I've
don't know.
been using it in. Okay.
I don't know. I will say that I know that a self-cleaning
How do I
oven
find
does
that
work. Well, I can ask Rabbi Hanoka, meaning our Rabbi Hanoka's brother, the one who was here once in the class.
If you would.
I can ask him that. A self-cleaning oven would work. Sticking it into your self-cleaning oven.
Okay.
That's fine.
You can
would
run
go
it
through.
for a few.
No.
You run a whole
So
cycle.
for,
Yeah.
for one piece, it would be easier
One or
just to
two
put in
pieces.
boiling water.
Well, not necessarily. Depends,
Do
Okay.
it. Thank you.
You got it.
I save them up.
Oh,
Let's end the class here today. Okay? Hopefully that last comment was very helpful to many of you.
Thank
And
you.
with this, we will conclude our lesson for today of Stepping Up Kosher. We look forward to seeing you all, same time, same place, same Facebook link for Stepping Up Kosher next week, Sunday mornings at 11 a.m.